Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we'll be discussing the Rambam Hilchas Avadim, Perik Aleph, Halacha Gimel, and Halacha Daled. The Rambam talks about an Eved Ivri, a Jewish servant, Shemachru Bezdin, who was sold by the courts because of a theft that he didn't have money to pay. So the halacha is, Ein Meichen Eisa Elo Yisrael Ole Ger Tzedek. You're not allowed to sell him to anyone but another Jew or a born Jewish or someone who converted, Ger Tzedek. Chein HaMeicha Atzmai. Similarly, someone who sells himself because of poverty. Ein Rishoy Limcha Atzmo L'Goy. He's not allowed to sell himself to a Gentile. Afilu L'Ger Toshav, even if he's a resident Gentile, that he has the permission to live in Israel, he follows the rules of a Ger Toshav. Ve'im avar macha atzmai, afilu l'ever avodah zara, afilu avodah zara atzma harei ze macha. And if he did sell himself and he violated, even if he sold himself to an idolater and even to the service of idolatry, the sale is a valid sale. Okay, then in Halacha Daled he says, Ba, if the Eved Ivri comes, v'amalacha, and he says to you, I'm going to sell myself to Gentiles, but he hasn't yet done it. You don't have to try to redeem him until he's actually sold. But after he's sold to a non-Jew, even though he violated and he did something improperly, and one might think he did it to himself, why should we care? Mitzvah of Daisa, there's a mitzvah to redeem him, that he shouldn't assimilate amongst them, and therefore you have to redeem him. Now, there's a dispute in Yeridea between the Ramah and the Taz, and it has been resolved, or at least proof has been brought from this halacha to each of these opinions. The question is, if someone has violated Jewish law to the point where Jewish law requires to put him in a state of nidui, which is a form of excommunication, it's a penalty that the person is not allowed to participate in with other people and so on and so forth. It's a penalty to get the person to change. The question is, what happens if we know that by virtue of us penalizing the person and excommunicating him, this will cause the person to go downhill, and it might cause him to become even more distant from Judaism? Should we take the risk and put him in the state of excommunication, knowing the consequences? So the Ramah says, no, we don't care, because we have to go by what is the situation now. This person deserves to be excommunicated. We can't consider what the future might bring. The Taz, however, disagrees, and he says that we shouldn't have him excommunicated because it could lead to dire consequences. Things could get much worse than they are now, and we will be the cause of it. So one of the proofs the Taz brings to his opinion is from the Gemara, that says that if a person goes downhill to such an extent that he's selling himself to the service of idolatry, nevertheless, we don't consider that. We have to redeem him so that he shouldn't assimilate, as the Rambam just ruled, which is taken from the Gemara in Kedushin, Daf Chaf Amud Beis. So you see, even when you're dealing with a really low life, someone who's willing to sell himself for idolatry, we have to protect him from going downhill. But the Chassam Sofer says that no, this halacha does not prove the case of the Taz. And he says that the Ramah is correct. And he proves it from this very halacha over here that we just learned. Here we learned in the halacha that, yes, we said before that if a person sells himself, we're supposed to redeem him. But if he only says he's going to sell himself, but he hasn't yet sold himself, we're not obligated to help him. We say, look, we have no obligation to help you, even though he's threatening and the situation will deteriorate. Nevertheless, we don't have to help him until he actually sells himself and he brings himself down to that level. That means that, according to halacha, you don't have to consider what the future will bring. You look at the situation now. The person threatens to sell himself, but he hasn't sold himself. Those are words, mere words. When he sells himself, the situation changes. So, according to the Chassam Sofer, the Ramah is correct that we don't care what the situation will lead to, we care what the situation is now. And therefore, according to the Chassam Sofer, he supports the Ramah that we should excommunicate the person who deserves to be excommunicated, and we shouldn't consider the possible negative consequences. But one could perhaps make a distinction between this case and the case of the Ramah. In the case of the Ramah, of excommunication, we're trying to actively do something to put this person in a position where it could lead to their deterioration, to degeneration. Right now, the person is at a certain level of a lack of religiosity. That's why we have to consider whether we should excommunicate him. But by excommunicating him, it'll go down to a much lower level. So we're actively doing something that causes him harm. In the case of the Rambam over here, that when the person says he's going to sell himself, not having to save him, because here you're not doing anything. Here you're passive. You're not saving him. You're not stopping him. You're not preventing him from selling himself by giving him money, so he shouldn't have to sell himself. So when you're dealing with a passive way of doing this, it could be very well that the Ramah would agree that this is something that we don't have an obligation to do. We don't have an obligation to go out of our way to save him. But once a person is in a position where you're going to actively cause him to go downhill, even the Rambam would agree that you're not supposed to do that.